This case isn't famous because it's complicated. It's famous because it's documented and still feels unfinished. America expected a courtroom reckoning for Jeffrey Epstein. Instead, it got a death in federal custody, official reports, and a national trust collapse. Jeffrey Epstein was a convicted sex offender when federal prosecutors brought a second case in 2019. Years earlier, official records had already established that minors were abused, money was exchanged, and the case ended with limited punishment. After that first case, he returned to wealth, travel, and unrestricted access to the same kind of private environments that had enabled the original conduct. The scope of reported abuse remained split across jurisdictions and constrained by sealed agreements, which prevented a single public accounting. The 2019 arrest followed extensive investigative reporting, civil filings, and witness statements describing a repeatable system, recruitment of minors, payment, repeated access, and the use of money to control disclosure. Federal charges alleged sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy. Epstein was taken into custody and held in a federal detention facility, pending trial. The case moved into active criminal litigation, where financial records, travel documentation, communications, and witness testimony became evidence under federal procedure. A public trial would have forced those materials into a structured record through motions, sworn testimony, and evidentiary rulings. No trial occurred. In August 2019, Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell, transported to a hospital, and pronounced dead the same day. The official ruling was suicide by hanging. The federal prosecution ended immediately and was replaced by a custodial death investigation. Investigators documented failures inside the detention facility, including missed checks and falsified records. Official reviews concluded suicide and reported no evidence of homicide, while also describing breakdowns in custodial safeguards that should have prevented an unobserved death. After his death, public attention shifted to two claims: murder, to prevent disclosure, and the existence of a hidden client list used for blackmail. Investigations and official reviews stated there was no evidence supporting homicide and no verified criminal client list. The case continued through document releases, rather than courtroom testimony. Records connected to Epstein's activities were disclosed through court proceedings, civil litigation, and government releases, including financial records, travel logs, emails, evidence inventories, and investigative material. Many pages were redacted to protect victims and uncharged individuals. The record showed patterns of movement, association, and recurring conduct, but did not establish a broader criminal hierarchy beyond what had been charged or proven. Authorities stated the available materials did not support new criminal cases against unnamed third parties. The case remained a recurring public issue because additional transparency requests continued after official findings were published. Efforts to unseal grand jury material repeatedly ran into legal protections intended to safeguard victims and uncharged people. Courts reviewed those requests under established rules and did not alter the core conclusions already reached in the investigations. The outcome was defined by a clear sequence: a limited first resolution, a reopened federal prosecution in 2019, a custodial death before trial, documented jail failures, official findings of suicide without homicide evidence, and a long aftermath driven by partial records, redactions, and ongoing legal limits on disclosure. Jeffrey Epstein entered elite spaces without the standard credentials that usually justify entry. He moved through early roles by positioning himself near wealth and influence, relying on proximity to status as a substitute for verifiable qualifications. A short period in education placed him close to families with concentrated power and money. He then shifted into finance, an industry where discretion is a product, and where access can be monetized without public transparency. That transition gave him operational cover, private clients, private meetings, and private arrangements that left limited public traces. In the early 1980s, he created his own financial operation and marketed it as exclusive. He presented himself as selective, serving only extremely wealthy clients, which discouraged scrutiny because secrecy could be framed as part of the service. Public reporting repeatedly noted that his lifestyle and reach appeared larger than what a conventional advisory business would typically produce. The source and scale of his wealth became a persistent unresolved question in public accounts, but his image as a discreet financier functioned as protection inside elite environments that often tolerate opacity when it seems useful. He built physical infrastructure that matched that model. Multiple properties, staffed residences, and controlled guest access created environments where movement and interactions could be managed away from routine oversight. A private island increased that insulation by limiting access and reducing casual observation. Staff routines, private transportation, and repeatable logistics made his life operationally self-contained. At the same time, he maintained a public posture that suggested legitimacy through influence and philanthropic visibility, even when the underlying structure operated privately. His social legitimacy was reinforced through repeated proximity to high-status circles. He presented himself not as a public figure, demanding attention, but as someone who could offer value in private, funding, introductions, hospitality, and financial access. Repetition did the work. The more he appeared in prestigious settings, the easier it became for observers to treat his presence as proof of belonging, rather than a reason to verify how he got there. That social effect mattered later, because it reduced early suspicion and increased the likelihood that accusations would be doubted or minimized. The first major wave of documented allegations emerged in the mid-2000s. Reports described underage girls being offered money for massages that escalated into sexual abuse inside a Florida residence. The complaints were formal, not vague, and they produced investigative material. The accounts described a consistent structure: recruitment, payment, escalation, and leverage over teenagers. The pattern was not random. It relied on repeatable steps, and it expanded through recruitment pipelines that pushed victims to bring in additional girls. The legal response became one of the defining turning points. Instead of a broad prosecution aligned with the scale of the allegations, the resolution narrowed exposure and limited consequences. Epstein served a short custodial sentence on state charges and registered as a sex offender. The deal and the way it was handled drew long-term criticism and later official scrutiny. The outcome mattered not only because the penalty was limited, but because it prevented a wider public accounting. A contained case was survivable. A full-scale federal case would have forced disclosure of structure, logistics, and volume. After release, he retained wealth, mobility, and access to elite environments. The period that followed was not a clean break. Civil litigation and investigative reporting continued, and survivor accounts described patterns consistent with earlier allegations. The idea that he had been punished and deterred did not match the continued reports of recruitment networks and ongoing access to vulnerable girls. By 2018, renewed investigative attention raised the case from a past controversy to an active federal priority. Reporting and new allegations increased pressure to reopen the investigation at a scale that had previously been avoided. In 2019, Epstein was indicted in New York on federal charges of sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy. He pleaded not guilty. The federal case carried a different threat than the earlier resolution: expanded discovery, deeper documentation, and a process that could not be contained through quiet settlement. While detained, the case moved toward a trial that would have created a complete public record. Evidence would have been tested in court. Witness testimony would have been heard under oath. Financial and travel documentation would have been explained in context, even without naming additional people. A trial would have forced clarity on how recruitment worked, how payments were handled, how travel was arranged, and how staff and properties supported the operation. That is why the period between indictment and death became the highest stakes segment of the timeline. In August 2019, Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell and later pronounced dead. The official ruling was suicide. His death ended the possibility of trial testimony, and a courtroom record that could have replaced speculation was sworn fact. Detention failures immediately became part of the narrative, including questions about monitoring, staffing, supervision, housing decisions, and surveillance. Subsequent inquiries documented procedural breakdowns and concluded there was no evidence of homicide. But the failures were significant enough to intensify public distrust that had already been shaped by the earlier limited legal outcome. The case shifted from prosecution to aftermath. Criminal accountability ended with his death, but the unresolved issues expanded: how his system operated, why the first legal resolution was so narrow, how he retained mobility after conviction, and why institutions acted late. The story persisted not because evidence vanished, but because the central trial never happened, and the final public accounting never occurred. On July 6, 2019, Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport, New Jersey, on federal charges of sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy. The charges were the result of years of investigation, survivor testimonies, and renewed attention to his network of abuse. Following his arrest, Epstein was quickly arraigned and pleaded not guilty to all charges. His bail was denied, and he was placed in the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, in New York. After his arrest, Epstein was initially placed on suicide watch, following an injury found in his cell, but within days he was moved to a special housing unit due to concerns over the adequacy of suicide watch protocols for a high-profile detainee. As his trial approached, his health continued to be monitored closely, though the tension surrounding his incarceration grew. On August 10, 2019, Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell during a routine check. He was transferred to a hospital and later pronounced dead. The New York City Medical Examiner ruled his death a suicide by hanging. But the circumstances surrounding the death quickly became a subject of speculation. Many questioned the official ruling, and the incident fueled conspiracy theories. Subsequent investigations into his death revealed significant procedural failures within MCC. Welfare checks were missed, and surveillance footage was either unavailable or incomplete during critical hours. The Department of Justice's Office of the Inspector General documented that staff had falsified records, and 2 guards were later charged with record falsification, neglect of duty. With Epstein's death, the federal prosecution was closed, as there was no longer a defendant to prosecute. The case, once a high-profile federal investigation, shifted focus to the failures of the detention system, raising questions about whether Epstein's death was an intentional attempt to prevent him from testifying against powerful individuals. After his death, numerous documents related to Epstein's activities were released, including financial records, travel logs, and email correspondence. These materials revealed connections and patterns that pointed to Epstein's extensive network, but they did not confirm the existence of a client list or implicate any other high-profile individuals. Despite the disclosures, no further criminal charges were filed, and the case remained focused on Epstein's past actions. Civil lawsuits continued after Epstein's death, with survivors seeking damages for the abuse they endured and holding accountable those who had enabled Epstein's actions. However, these legal proceedings did not lead to new criminal investigations into Epstein's network. The handling of Epstein's case raised significant concerns about the influence of wealth and power within the justice system. His death prevented the possibility of a full trial and public reckoning, leaving critical questions about the scope of his network unanswered. The civil litigation and released documents kept public interest alive, but the absence of a trial left many believing that the full story was still hidden. Jeffrey Epstein was born in New York City in 1953 and grew up in a middle-class setting that did not predict the scale of wealth and access he later displayed. He attended college, but did not complete a degree. That gap mattered because his later position in elite finance depended on credibility. Yet he built that credibility without the normal academic or professional milestones that usually explain entry into the highest tiers. His first significant foothold came through education, rather than banking. He taught at a prestigious private school in Manhattan, a setting populated by wealthy families and influential networks. The job placed him inside an environment where introductions and familiarity can carry more weight than formal credentials. When that phase ended, it left behind something useful: exposure to the habits and expectations of people whose money and connections opened doors. He then moved into finance in the 1970s at a major Wall Street firm during a period when investment banking was expanding and rewarding aggressive deal culture. That environment prized confidence, access, and the ability to sell discretion. Even without a long tenure, the experience provided him with institutional association that could be leveraged later. It also gave him the vocabulary and posture needed to present himself as an insider, which is often enough to gain meetings, attract attention, and reduce scrutiny in circles where privacy is expected. In 1982, he formed his own firm and built its image around exclusivity. He claimed to accept only extremely wealthy clients. That framing served a practical purpose. It created scarcity, and it provided an excuse for why outsiders could not verify his work. In a conventional model, reputation is built through visible transactions and publicly traceable accomplishments. In his model, the absence of detail was presented as proof of elite clientele. Over time, this became central to how he operated. Secrecy was not a side effect, it was the product. From the 1990s onward, his lifestyle expanded in ways that signaled major wealth. He accumulated multiple properties in different locations and maintained staffed environments that required sustained overhead. He acquired a private island in the Caribbean, an asset that increased control by restricting access and limiting observation. These properties were not only symbols, they were controlled spaces where routines, visitors, and movement could be managed through staff, scheduling, and private transportation. At the same time, he cultivated social legitimacy through repeated presence in high-status circles. He appeared in settings associated with money, influence, and institutional credibility, including philanthropic and high-end social environments. That pattern created a protective effect, because proximity often becomes mistaken for proof. When people repeatedly see someone around prestige, they assume the person has been vetted, even when the basis for that assumption is weak. His lifestyle required operational infrastructure, and that infrastructure mattered later. Large residences do not function without staff routines that manage entries, scheduling, transportation, and privacy. When allegations later described repeated abuse, rather than isolated incidents, the relevant question expanded beyond individual actions to the environment that allowed repetition. How access was arranged, how visits were normalized, how payments were handled, and how the household structure reduced the chance of outside scrutiny. By the early 2000s, his visibility increased, while the details of his private conduct remained largely unexamined. The public accepted secrecy as part of his claimed role, which lowered pressure to verify how he made money and how he operated. When accusations later surfaced, that same secrecy stopped looking like discretion and started looking like concealment. The shift was structural. A person who trains observers to accept opacity gains time and freedom when misconduct depends on what stays hidden. The first major allegations that entered public record described a repeatable pattern. Money offered for massages that escalated into sexual acts involving underage girls, tied to a specific residence. The consistency mattered because it suggested planning rather than chance. Reports that some victims were as young as 14 removed any ambiguity about the nature of the conduct and reframed the situation as exploitation of children. From that point, his rise could not be separated from the apparatus around him. Multiple locations, controlled properties, private movement, and staff-supported privacy that made repeated access possible. The contradiction became fixed. A man without a completed degree and without a publicly documented record explaining his fortune had built the footprint of a global elite figure, then faced detailed allegations describing a structured pattern of abuse involving minors and cash. What followed was not just an investigation into individual wrongdoing. It was a test of whether an identity built on exclusivity and secrecy could survive once secrecy became the mechanism. People blamed for how long it took the system to confront him. By 2005, specific complaints began collapsing the gap between Jeffrey Epstein's public reputation and what was happening inside his Palm Beach residence. The allegations did not start as loose rumor. They arrived as reports from underage girls describing a consistent setup: cash offers, access to the mansion, and encounters introduced as massages that escalated into sexual abuse. The Palm Beach setting mattered because it fixed the claims to a single place with repeatable patterns that investigators could test. Investigators began collecting accounts that matched in structure. A girl was offered money, directed or brought to the residence, and ushered inside through an entry process controlled by the household. The massage framing served a practical cover. It explained why a teenager might be seen going into a wealthy man's home and leaving with cash, without immediately triggering a public assumption of sexual crime. The reports described a predictable progression. The interaction shifted from massage to sexual contact, pressure increased in stages, and payment functioned as both incentive and leverage. The allegations expanded because recruitment was described as built into the process. Victims reported being urged to bring other girls, sometimes with the promise of payment even if the original victim did not return. That element created scale. It also created a chain effect for investigators. One complaint pointed toward other potential victims, because recruitment allegedly moved through peers. As interviews accumulated, the repeated pattern, money, private residence, massage cover, escalation, became difficult to treat. Once multiple accounts described the same mechanics, the case stopped looking like a single incident and began looking like a sustained operation. Investigators could pursue supporting evidence that a one-time allegation rarely produces: phone contacts, visitor flow, scheduling patterns, travel activity, and staff routines that managed access. The reports implicated not only conduct, but the operating environment. A large residence runs on gatekeeping, schedules, and staff-controlled movement. When victims describe being directed through routines, the investigative focus naturally broadens to how repetition was made possible. The case moved into formal legal stages, including grand jury proceedings. Grand jury secrecy is standard, intended to protect investigative integrity and safeguard victims and uncharged individuals. In this case, secrecy later became a lasting point of public dispute because Epstein's public image relied on discretion, and any sealed record was interpreted as concealment rather than procedure. Despite the number and consistency of allegations, the matter did not become a full federal prosecution at that time. Instead, it resolved through an agreement that avoided federal charges and narrowed the case into state-level prostitution-related offenses. Epstein received a limited sentence and sex offender registration. The controversy was not only that he went to jail, but that the outcome appeared far smaller than what many believed the reported conduct could have supported under broader prosecution. He served roughly 13 months under that arrangement. The result created two durable interpretations. One interpretation treated the case as closed because a conviction and sentence existed. The other treated it as containment because the outcome reduced scope, reduced exposure, and appeared to minimize crimes involving minors. That second interpretation hardened into a long-term belief that wealth and influence had shaped the result and reduced accountability. Later internal review by the Justice Department criticized how the agreement had been handled, describing major failures in judgment. That acknowledgement mattered because it came from within the system, but it did not change the legal reality. The deal had already limited what could be pursued. and the opportunity to build a wider criminal case at that stage was gone. In practical terms, the resolution allowed Epstein to exit custody, still wealthy, still mobile, and still connected, despite the sex offender designation. Registration imposes real obligations, but it does not automatically dismantle assets, properties, staff structures, or private travel capability. It does not erase networks built over years. The long-term impact was structural. The first major legal reckoning ended through negotiated narrowing rather than full exposure. Epstein was publicly labeled a sex offender, but the process left unanswered questions about scale, number of victims, and whether others played roles in recruitment or facilitation. That gap became the foundation for later resurgence, because once the public concludes the first outcome was incomplete, later secrecy is interpreted as protection rather than law. In 2008, Jeffrey Epstein's case narrowed instead of expanding. The outcome was defined by a plea agreement, limited charges, and a sentence that many later viewed as far smaller than the allegations suggested. The justice system acted, but it acted in a way that capped exposure and reduced the chance of a wider accounting. The allegations tied to Palm Beach described underage girls, cash payments framed as massages, and escalation into sexual acts. Investigators had gathered interviews and supporting detail that pointed to repetition rather than an isolated incident. Yet when the matter reached resolution, the charges centered on prostitution-related offenses. Federal prosecution was avoided, and the case was finalized in state court, closing off the broader questions that had already formed around the pattern of reported abuse. Epstein received about 13 months in custody and was required to register as a sex offender. The sentence carried weight on paper, but the way it was carried out diluted its effect. Work release allowed him to spend significant portions of his days outside jail, maintaining contact, preserving routines, and limiting the practical disruption that incarceration usually imposes. The public saw a convicted sex offender returning to a life still protected by money and leverage, reinforcing the perception that his punishment operated under different rules. The plea agreement's larger impact was structural. By steering the case away from federal charges, it limited the forum that could have tested broader questions through federal investigative tools and a wider scope. That narrowing reduced the chance of examining whether conduct crossed state lines, whether additional victims existed beyond the local frame, and whether others played roles in recruitment, scheduling, or concealment. Those possibilities were not disproven by the deal. They were left untested inside the most expansive legal pathway available at the time. Secrecy intensified the damage. Victims later argued they were not given meaningful notice or participation consistent with victim rights expectations, and that the process treated their involvement as secondary to managing exposure. The agreement became a public symbol of negotiated containment, a result shaped to minimize publicity, restrict scope, and limit the record that would follow Epstein for the rest of his life. Even after the criminal matter was declared resolved, the case remained active through filings, challenges, and re-examinations. Victims and their representatives pursued legal pathways, focused on how the deal had been handled, and whether the process had failed to meet basic standards. The criminal case ended, but the procedural and civil fallout kept the story alive, and kept scrutiny on why the outcome had been structured to narrow rather than expand. The contradiction was straightforward. Epstein was publicly branded as a sex offender, yet the resolution left a widespread belief that he had been protected from broader accountability. That belief did not require theories about hidden forces. It was rooted in visible features of the outcome: reduced scope, minimized exposure, controlled release conditions, and a rapid return to freedom relative to what many understood the allegations to involve. As time passed, the 2008 result became the reference point for everything that followed. When later reporting and additional allegations resurfaced, they landed in a public already convinced that Epstein had received an escape route once before. That history-shaped interpretation of every new disclosure, strengthened skepticism toward institutional explanations, and reinforced the idea that the first reckoning had been engineered to prevent a full federal-style exposure. By the end of 2008, the legal system had produced a result that could have closed the narrative. Instead, it created a lasting unresolved space: how far the conduct extended, how many victims existed, and what a broader prosecution might have uncovered if the case had not been narrowed. That unresolved space became the foundation for the case's return years later, amplified by the perception that the first outcome had contained the damage rather than documenting the full scope. After his 2008 conviction and release, Jeffrey Epstein returned to public life as a registered sex offender. The label implied restriction, but it did not remove the resources that gave him leverage. He kept high-end properties, maintained a travel and staff infrastructure, and continued operating in private settings where access was controlled. The visible result was a gap between formal punishment and real limitation, reinforcing the view that the 2008 outcome did not dismantle his ability to function. He complied with sex offender registration requirements, including recurring check-ins. Those rules existed, but they did not break the network he had built. He still operated in environments where introductions, invitations, and private meetings could occur away from public view. Wealth protected mobility. Prior connections did not automatically disappear. What changed was reputational pressure. Every appearance became riskier for the people around him, and each continued association signaled that some circles were willing to tolerate that risk. Accountability pressure shifted into other channels. Civil actions and victim rights litigation became the main path for challenging the earlier resolution. The focus expanded beyond his conduct to the process that had produced such a narrow outcome. Arguments centered on victims being sidelined, key terms being hidden until challenge became difficult, and legal strategy being used to control exposure. As more details about how the 2008 outcome was structured became public, the story turned into an example of how a defendant with resources can narrow a case, reduce consequences, and limit public record. During these years, the case also kept generating supporting material that reinforced the perception of repeat conduct. Documents and filings referenced schedules, travel patterns, and recurring themes tied to recruitment, payments framed as massages and escalation. Even without new criminal charges, these disclosures kept the story active. They also kept institutional pressure alive by contradicting the idea that the 2008 outcome had captured the full scope of what had been alleged and investigated. Epstein's post-conviction status became a separate battlefield. He pursued efforts to reduce the severity of his registration classification, part of a broader pattern of minimizing long-term consequences. Resistance to those efforts increased attention on how unusual his situation appeared, even within systems familiar with sex offender proceedings. The attempt itself reinforced the perception that he was still managing outcomes rather than being contained by them. The social side remained unstable because it raised a simple question. Why would influential circles tolerate proximity to a convicted sex offender? Two factors drove that tolerance. Elite networks often reward money, access, and private hospitality, even when association carries risk. At the same time, the limited nature of the 2008 charges and sentence gave some people a narrow narrative to justify continued contact. For critics and victims, that rationalization became another example of how power can protect itself through selective framing. Public suspicion hardened during this period because the earlier legal choices created a credibility gap. When a case with multiple accusers ended in a short sentence with unusual release conditions, many assumed missing facts. Sealed or constrained records amplified that assumption. Limited transparency created space for speculation, and speculation escalated into fixed beliefs for some observers. The engine was not only rumor, it was the visible mismatch between what was alleged and what was punished. Even without a new indictment, the story stayed alive through filings, investigative attention, and repeated reminders that the first reckoning did not feel complete. Each year Epstein remained active in elite environments, made the 2008 outcome look less like closure and more like a pause. The questions sharpened over time, because the continued visibility suggested that formal conviction had not reduced functional power. By the end of this period, the environment had shifted. The tolerance that allowed Epstein to remain functional after conviction began to erode under sustained public memory and scrutiny. His post-2008 years demonstrated a central point. A conviction can exist without closure, and a narrow legal outcome can become the reason a case returns larger later. Civil litigation, emerging records, and renewed investigative focus turned the unresolved space left by 2008 into the setup for the next stage, where the system would be forced to revisit what had been contained, and the next legal response would face higher expectations than a limited settlement. The years after Jeffrey Epstein's 2008 conviction did not dismantle the structure that had enabled him. He kept a private system of staff, properties, travel logistics, and controlled access. The official record labeled him a sex offender, but he still had the resources that mattered: money, private space, and the ability to arrange meetings away from public view. That gap between formal stigma and practical capability became the condition that allowed the situation to persist. As the decade progressed, the 2008 case remained a reference point, not a conclusion. Court filings and investigative attention kept returning to the same fact. The outcome had been narrow, negotiated, and insulated from broader federal prosecution. The public understood the basic shape, even without following every detail: underage victims, a plea deal, and punishment that did not match what the allegations suggested. That mismatch became the center of the controversy, and stayed there. What changed over time was the climate around such cases. Public attention increased toward sexual exploitation, institutional failures, and how victims were treated by the system. Epstein's case was positioned for re-examination because it already carried documented signs of weakness in process. Victims sidelined, major terms kept sealed, and accountability contained. The story stayed active in the background, because it was never perceived as finished. Renewed reporting brought the earlier case back into national focus by reconstructing timelines, revisiting court records, and documenting how Epstein continued operating after conviction. The visible fact that he remained functional in elite environments made the earlier punishment look temporary, rather than decisive. The focus shifted from the conduct itself to the system that had allowed him to remain protected and mobile after being convicted. As scrutiny intensified, the protective buffer around Epstein began to weaken. Individuals and institutions that had tolerated proximity faced reputational questions. The 2008 deal was framed more clearly as unusually favorable, and that framing raised a direct issue: what had been limited or sacrificed to produce it? The story became a liability, not a closed chapter, because renewed attention made further containment harder. This pressure also changed the law enforcement environment. Federal authorities did not need to construct a new narrative from scratch. They needed to assess whether earlier containment had left conduct that could still be prosecuted and proved. Allegations involving recruitment, trafficking dynamics, and repeat abuse were not disproven by the 2008 outcome. They were narrowed by it. The revived attention pushed the earlier case into the category of unfinished business. By 2018, renewed accounts and victim allegations surfaced in a climate less willing to accept quiet outcomes. The descriptions repeated familiar elements, recruitment patterns, control mechanisms, and repeat access, suggesting continuity rather than a closed episode. The significance of continuity was structural. It supported the view that the abuse was enabled by a repeatable system, not isolated incidents. Federal investigators moved toward a different framing than the earlier prosecution. Instead of treating the conduct as a localized scandal resolved through state charges, the emerging approach centered on trafficking and conspiracy. That framing raised the stakes by expanding the scope of evidence, increasing investigative reach, and targeting the broader architecture that the earlier deal had avoided. When the federal case activated, Epstein's status changed immediately. He was no longer a convicted offender living under managed constraints. He became an active defendant facing severe federal charges tied to the most serious allegations. Investigators focused on records that could establish patterns and corroborate testimony, including travel, scheduling, payments, and communications. The case moved from retrospective outrage into an active legal process. The 2019 arrest marked the second phase in concrete form. A man who had previously avoided full federal exposure was now in federal custody, under charges that could not be resolved quietly, without scrutiny. Custody itself became part of the case's meaning, because the system was now being tested on whether it could handle the prosecution without repeating earlier failure. Inside detention, risk became central. Epstein's survival carried consequences beyond one defendant, because any harm or death would trigger public belief that the system had collapsed again. That made custody conditions unusually sensitive, and it made procedural breakdowns, missed checks, missing records, supervision failures, capable of becoming a national legitimacy crisis. The story ends here at maximum pressure. Epstein is federally charged, held in a system that must keep him alive and secure, and surrounded by a public that no longer accepts contained outcomes. The second prosecution is underway, and every procedural failure will be read through the history of the first. The central issue is no longer only what Epstein did. It is whether institutions can manage a case this toxic without failing in ways that destroy trust. Epstein's federal detention turned the case into a time-critical problem. The indictment moved the story from past allegations into an active prosecution with major consequences. And custody became the point where everything could collapse. From the moment he entered the Manhattan facility, the outcome depended on whether the jail could follow basic safeguards under scrutiny. Every housing decision, every supervision step, and every shortcut mattered because a failure would destroy confidence in the process. The detention facility was overcrowded and under strain. Staffing shortages, overtime, and routine breakdowns were known risks in that environment. Epstein's placement inside it increased the stakes, because he was not an ordinary detainee. The nature of the charges and the public reaction to any harm required consistent monitoring and documentation. The environment relied on routines vulnerable to fatigue and lax enforcement. And that vulnerability mattered more because the case required precision. In the weeks before his death, his status drew increased internal attention. Monitoring conditions were adjusted, housing arrangements changed, and observation protocols existed on paper. Enforcement depended on individuals working in a pressured system. The structure required strict compliance. The environment produced inconsistency. That gap created the conditions where a single lapse would not be treated as ordinary negligence, but as a system-level failure with predictable public fallout. In August 2019, Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell, transported to a hospital, and pronounced dead. Authorities ruled the death a suicide. The prosecution ended immediately, but the story did not. His death became an event that intensified suspicion, because it removed the possibility of trial testimony and courtroom exposure. Public reaction formed before consolidated reporting could stabilize the timeline. The immediate damage came from unclear and delayed clarity about basic custodial facts, questions centered on housing decisions, the absence of a cellmate at a critical time, staff actions around required checks, and the status of surveillance footage. Each unresolved point created space for the public to assume the worst, because the case involved a defendant whose survival had become tied to institutional credibility. Autopsy details amplified conflict, rather than resolving it. Neck injuries were interpreted in competing ways. While officials emphasized that such injuries can occur in hanging and do not by themselves prove homicide, that medical nuance did not calm skepticism. In a case already defined by distrust, standard indicators were treated as questionable, and efforts to close the matter were interpreted by some as evidence of concealment. Speculation expanded, because it offered a cleaner explanation than negligence. If the death was suicide, the public lost the chance for a trial record that could establish facts under oath. If the death was murder, the story could be framed as intentional prevention of disclosure. That framing also reinforced a wider claim that Epstein possessed a decisive hidden list connected to powerful people. The list functioned as a concept, an assumed key to broader accountability, whether or not a single verified document supported it. After the death, official releases aimed to rebuild a timeline. Records emerged through legal processes and related litigation. Flight logs and contact materials circulated widely, often without context, and were used to argue opposing narratives. Redactions and omissions became part of the dispute rather than routine legal handling. The case shifted into a permanent public investigation driven by partial records and selective interpretation. A later federal watchdog report reconstructed failures inside the facility and described preventable breakdowns in supervision and procedure. It concluded the death was suicide and stated there was no evidence of homicide. The report separated negligence from conspiracy, but the documented failures were severe enough that many readers treated them as proof of something deeper rather than proof of systemic dysfunction. Epstein's death ended the direct prosecution, but did not end detention. The case moved into an afterlife of documents, depositions, civil litigation, and institutional reviews. The center of gravity moved away from a trial toward whether the system could deliver an account that the public would accept while still protecting victims and uncharged individuals. After Epstein's death, the case shifted from a criminal prosecution to a fight over institutions and records. With no trial, disputes that would have been resolved in court moved into public space through litigation, reporting, and political messaging. The loss of a courtroom process increased scrutiny, because the main tool for producing a definitive record was gone. Two tracks moved at the same time. Federal agencies investigated what failed inside the detention facility, focusing on procedure, staffing, and administrative breakdowns. Separately, civil litigation and media work intensified, treating the death as the point where unanswered questions became harder to resolve, because the defendant could no longer be questioned or forced into testimony. Documents became the center of the conflict. Older court filings were revisited. Depositions and related materials surfaced in fragments and spread widely, often without full context. Travel logs, address books, and correspondence recirculated repeatedly, and public interpretation moved from evidence-based assessment into assumption-driven inference, where association was sometimes treated as proof. A structural clash dominated this phase: transparency versus legal protection. Courts faced ongoing requests to unseal material. Judges had to balance public interest against victim privacy, witness safety, and the rights of people who were never charged. Redactions were routine under those constraints, but each redaction increased suspicion for audiences, who assumed withheld text meant concealed wrongdoing. Partial releases often produced more controversy than silence, because they invited interpretation without providing full context. The idea of a definitive client list hardened into a public expectation. Official statements rejecting a confirmed list did not end the belief. Instead, the claim adapted, shifting into assumptions that such a list existed, but was hidden, split across documents, or indirectly encoded in other records. The lack of a single definitive document became part of the belief system, rather than a reason to abandon it. Political actors began using the case as a symbol. References to Epstein became tools for arguments about corruption, selective justice, and elite protection. Calls for full transparency became politically useful, even when the underlying constraints were legal, not discretionary. The story shifted further, from a case file into a recurring narrative used to mobilize distrust. Survivors continued pursuing civil cases aimed at facilitators and enablers. Those cases moved slowly, because they required careful evidentiary standards and protection of sensitive testimony. They did not replace a criminal trial, but they produced incremental disclosures that kept the story active and repeatedly returned the public to documents and institutional decisions. Media coverage split between investigation and amplification. Long-form reporting reassembled timelines and highlighted how Epstein navigated legal systems and reputational risk. At the same time, online interpretation, often detached from verifiable facts, blurring the boundary between documented failures and claimed conspiracies. The case became a frequent example of how institutional distrust turns ambiguity into certainty. Institutions tried to assert closure through watchdog reports, charges related to falsified jail records, and proposals for administrative reform. These actions demonstrated accountability for procedural failures, but could not recreate the missing trial. The timing of Epstein's death ensured that any official finding would feel incomplete to a large part of the public because the core evidentiary confrontation never happened. By the early 2020s, the case settled into a durable, unresolved state. It became a storehouse of documents, claims, and competing interpretations that could be reignited by new releases or political incentives. The defining element was Epstein's absence. The person who would have been cross-examined and forced to respond was gone, leaving debates anchored to records that could be read multiple ways. This phase ends with the Epstein case functioning as more than a criminal matter. It became a long-running test of trust in justice, transparency, and institutional competence, sustained by the lack of a trial record and by ongoing disputes over what should be released, what must remain protected, and what conclusions the public is willing to accept. The final phase unfolded without Jeffrey Epstein, because his death ended prosecution and removed the possibility of a trial record. The case shifted from courtroom resolution to institutional credibility, driven by documents, political pressure, and recurring demands for disclosure. The central issue became what authorities would release, what they would withhold, and whether the public would accept official conclusions. Federal agencies published reviews and restated findings, suicide, and no verified evidence supporting claims of murder, organized blackmail networks, or a definitive master list of accomplices. Those statements aimed to close the factual boundary of the case, but repeated reaffirmations did not produce trust. For many observers, the more institutions insisted the matter was settled, the more it looked like an effort to end scrutiny, rather than answer it. Public doubt pushed the story deeper into politics. Release the files became a demand rather than a request, and each promise of transparency was judged by what followed. Delays, redactions, or limited disclosures were interpreted as obstruction, even when driven by legal rules or victim protection requirements. The files became a proxy measure of institutional honesty. Grand jury secrecy became the main symbolic conflict. Courts were constrained by long-standing rules designed to protect victims and uncharged individuals, while public expectations shifted toward maximum exposure. Even when steps were taken to seek release, the process was slow and conditional, which reinforced suspicion rather than reducing it. Legal thresholds and procedural caution were treated as avoidance. Each new document release revived attention, but did not stabilize the narrative. Older material resurfaced and circulated as if newly discovered. Prior associations were reread through outrage and suspicion, while context weakened with repetition. The case moved away from timeline-based understanding and toward cumulative interpretation, where every fragment was treated as additional confirmation of a larger hidden structure. The lack of definitive new proof did not reduce engagement. It sustained the belief that decisive material was still being withheld. Institutions emphasized reforms and accountability measures tied to detention failures, highlighting administrative changes and misconduct enforcement. Those actions addressed procedural breakdowns, but did not satisfy the public demand created by the missing trial. The dominant public perception remained that the case ended before the fullest reckoning could occur. Over time, Epstein's name became shorthand for perceived elite protection and unequal justice. The core crimes remained central, but public attention increasingly focused on institutional behavior, earlier leniency, sealed material, custodial failure, and the inability to produce a single conclusive public record. In this phase, the case functioned less as an active investigation and more as an ongoing accusation against systems that appeared to have allowed long-term abuse and then failed to deliver final courtroom accountability. The legal system could not resolve the story in the way many people expected because the defendant was dead. Law produces closure through trial outcomes, sworn testimony, and verdicts. Documentation and official reports could not replace that authority. So institutional certainty competed with public skepticism that demanded a complete adversarial record. Survivors remained central, but the absence of a trial allowed attention to drift away from documented harm and toward broad theories of power. That shift was a direct consequence of the unfinished adjudication. Without courtroom focus, the public conversation moved toward institutional suspicion and symbolic narratives. By the time Epstein died, the case had already outgrown him. It had become a test of institutional performance, prosecutorial choices, law enforcement credibility, jail supervision, victim rights enforcement, and whether the public would accept official conclusions after years of delay and secrecy. The federal prosecution that could have forced a complete public record ended without trial, cross-examination, or a verdict. The space a trial would have filled was taken over by litigation, document releases, partial disclosures, and a public split that treated every new release as either confirmation of concealment or confirmation that nothing decisive existed. After 2019, government action split into two lanes. One lane was casework and review, prosecutions of related conduct, and official investigations that tried to lock down what could be proven. The other lane was operational accountability, inquiries into how a high-profile detainee could die in federal custody while under heightened monitoring expectation. Those reports described preventable breakdowns, staffing strain, missed checks, falsified logs, and surveillance limitations, then tried to separate negligence from conspiracy. The findings were detailed, but they could not replace the authority of a completed trial, which kept public skepticism active. As civil litigation and reporting continued, records emerged in waves through court processes, advocacy, and forced confirmations of what agencies held, what they did not hold, and what they would not disclose. Each cycle repeated the same pattern: more material, heavy redactions, and the same two interpretations. The earliest deal years before remained the deepest institutional scar, because it narrowed exposure, reduced risk for Epstein, and according to later reviews and reporting, handled victim participation in a way that intensified later distrust. That outcome became the reference point for everything that followed. Once the public saw a major case resolved through a bargain many viewed as unusually favorable, later claims of routine process were harder to sell. The earlier containment became the template people used to interpret every later seal, delay, and limitation. The story then entered a political phase shaped by repeated promises of total disclosure. Those promises raised expectations because they implied decisive artifacts existed: definitive lists, definitive names, definitive proof of a broader network, or definitive proof of concealment. Later official messaging shifted toward closure. A high-profile Justice Department and FBI position was described as finding no evidence of a client list, no credible evidence of a blackmail operation, targeting prominent individuals, and no basis for investigations of uncharged third parties, while reaffirming suicide and pointing to victim protection and sensitive evidence as limits on disclosure. That posture triggered backlash because it collided with years of public buildup, and because it offered finality without the trial record many people expected. Attempts to settle doubts using time and motion evidence, including releases of jailhouse surveillance footage intended to show no unauthorized entry into the relevant area, did not end the dispute. It redirected scrutiny to gaps, resets, what cameras did not capture, and why detention safeguards failed in the first place. Announced efforts to pursue court approval to unseal grand jury transcripts carried an unavoidable constraint. Grand jury secrecy is a legal wall, and any unsealing would face judicial limits, privacy concerns, and likely redactions, meaning the outcome would not match release everything expectations. Even if pursued, further file releases and correspondence continued to add claims about exploitation, coercive arrangements, and patterns tied to Epstein's properties and logistics. These disclosures reinforced continuity across years and locations, but they did not produce what the loudest public narrative demanded: a clean, courtroom-verified roster of culpable clients, confirmed through convictions. They expanded the record without delivering a single decisive map. The legacy became a paradox. The document trail grew, but certainty and trust did not. Official reviews emphasized institutional failure rather than assassination. Yet suspicion persisted because the failures were severe, and the earlier legal containment had already damaged credibility. Legal secrecy protected victims and due process, but secrecy also fueled the belief that the most important material remained hidden. The result was not a closed chapter, but a permanent file, sealed in parts, redacted in parts, litigated in parts, released in bursts, and argued over indefinitely, because the unanswered question for many people shifted from what Epstein did to whether the system that handled him could be trusted to tell the full truth about itself. Like, share, and subscribe to stay with the mystery crime for new cases.